Welcome to Forgotten Ties. What happens when the person you've spent 2 decades mourning, the person you buried in your heart, suddenly appears in the flesh, standing just 50 feet away? What if the past isn't just a memory, but a living, breathing entity waiting to pull you back into the nightmare? The reality we build for ourselves is fragile. It rests on a foundation of things we know to be true. But what happens when that foundation cracks? When the impossible stares you right in the face, not as a ghost, but as a man waiting for the 4:15 train. Thomas Avery was a man of logic. At 42, he was an architect, a profession built on precision, measurements, and the unshakable laws of physics. His world was one of concrete and steel, of blueprints where every line had a purpose. He lived in a restored brownstone in Brooklyn with his wife, Clara, a therapist whose understanding of the human mind was as deep as his was of structural integrity. They had a good life, a quiet life, one that Thomas had meticulously constructed in the wake of the tragedy that defined his youth. 20 years ago, his father, Robert Avery, had vanished. Robert was a charismatic, brilliant, and deeply troubled man, a literature professor who loved the sea. He had taken his sailboat, the Ariadne, out during a sudden squall off the coast of Maine. They found the wreckage, splintered wood washed ashore miles apart. They never found Robert. Thomas was 22, just out of college, and was left to identify a piece of the hull. The funeral was held over an empty casket, a hollow ritual that offered no closure, only a profound, echoing silence. Thomas learned to live with that silence. He filled it with work, with the quiet love he shared with Clara, with the predictable rhythm of a life well lived. The grief, once a roaring inferno, had dimmed to a dull, persistent ache, a missing piece of his own architecture. Until that Tuesday, it was a mundane afternoon. Grand Central Station was thrumming with its usual chaotic energy. The vast hall, with its celestial ceiling, was filled with the murmur of 1,000 conversations, the click-clack of heels, and the hiss of departing trains. Thomas was waiting on platform 22, checking his watch, his mind already home with Clara, debating whether they should order Thai or attempt the pasta recipe she'd bookmarked. He looked up, his gaze drifting across the platform, over the sea of faces. And he saw him. It wasn't a glance. It was a full-body shock, an electrical current that locked his muscles and stole the air from his lungs. 50 feet away, standing under the flickering departure board, was Robert Avery. He was older, of course. The dark hair Thomas remembered was now a distinguished silver gray, thinner on top. He wore a heavy, dark wool overcoat, the kind with a velvet collar that had gone out of style decades ago. The exact coat Robert had cherished. The man was checking a vintage pocket watch, just as Robert always had, snapping the gold lid shut with an audible click that Thomas felt he could hear even across the tracks. The posture was identical. The way he tilted his head, the slight, impatient tap of his foot. Thomas's mind screamed, "It's impossible. You are having a breakdown. It's stress. It's grief." But his eyes betrayed him. His heart, hammering against his ribs, knew what it was seeing. The man looked up, his gaze sweeping the platform, and for one agonizing, infinite second, his eyes, Robert's eyes, the same piercing blue, seemed to pass right over Thomas. There was no recognition, just the blank stare of a stranger. But Thomas saw the scar, a small white crescent just above his left eyebrow, from a sailing boom that had swung around and hit him when Thomas was 10. Thomas had been the one to fetch the first aid kit. The man turned, adjusting a worn leather satchel on his shoulder. A satchel Thomas recognized, the one his father had carried to the university every day. He began walking, not quickly, but with purpose, toward the 8-car train bound for Poughkeepsie, just as the all-aboard call echoed. "Dad!" The word was a choked whisper. Thomas was frozen. The architect in him was screaming at the faulty logic. The son in him was screaming in raw, primal need. He finally broke free of his paralysis. "Dad!" he yelled, this time loud enough to turn a few heads. He started to run, shoving past travelers, his own briefcase banging painfully against his leg. "Wait! Stop!" The man didn't turn around. He reached the train car, stepped aboard, and was immediately swallowed by the crowd inside. Thomas sprinted, reaching the doors just as they hissed shut. He pounded on the glass, his reflection a distorted mask of panic and disbelief. Through the window, he could see the man in the overcoat moving down the aisle, finding a seat, his back to the platform. The train jolted, then began to slide forward, slowly at first, then accelerating. Thomas ran alongside it for a few agonizing steps, banging on the glass, his voice lost to the screech of metal on metal. The train pulled out of the station, taking the ghost with it, leaving Thomas alone on the platform, gasping for breath, his entire, carefully constructed reality shattered into a million pieces. He stood there, trembling, long after the red lights of the train had vanished into the dark tunnel. The man at the station looked exactly like his father, and Thomas Avery had no idea what to do. The journey home was a blur. Thomas didn't remember the subway ride, the walk up the steps, or turning the key in his own front door. He found himself standing in his dimly lit hallway, his briefcase still gripped in his white-knuckled hand, while Clara looked up from the sofa, her expression of welcome fading into concern. He must have looked dreadful, his face pale as marble, his eyes wide and unfocused. He tried to speak, to articulate the seismic shock that had just ripped through his life, but the words wouldn't form. He just shook his head, managing only a strangled whisper. "I saw him, Clara. I saw my father." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking clock on the mantel. Clara, ever the pragmatist, guided him to the sofa. She listened patiently as he recounted the scene in disjointed, frantic sentences. The coat, the watch, the scar. She didn't dispute him. She didn't call him crazy, but her eyes held a deep, professional sadness. She diagnosed it as a grief hallucination, a manifestation of stress and unresolved trauma, perhaps triggered by the anniversary of the accident, which was only a few weeks away. "Thomas," she said softly, her hand on his. "He's gone. What you saw. It was someone who looked like him." Your mind filled in the blanks. He wanted to believe her. The architect in him desperately needed to believe her. It was the only logical explanation, but the son in him knew what he saw. The next day he called in sick to work, the first time in years. He told Clara he was going for a walk, but his feet carried him back to Grand Central. He stood on platform 22 at 4:15 p.m., his heart a painful drum. He watched the Poughkeepsie train arrive, watched the passengers board. Every older man with gray hair sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. But Robert wasn't there. He went back the next day and the next. It became a ritual, a desperate pilgrimage. He was neglecting his projects. He stopped sleeping. He would sit up late, nursing a whiskey, staring at the single-framed photo he had of his father, searching the face for an answer. Clara watched him, her worry turning into a quiet fear. He was slipping away from her, pulled under by a ghost. The logical part of his mind knew he needed proof, something tangible to fight the narrative of his own encroaching madness. If the man was real, he had to be going somewhere. Poughkeepsie. What was in Poughkeepsie? He remembered the satchel. That worn, brown leather satchel. His father had been fastidious about his belongings. Thomas felt a sudden, electric urge. He went to the attic, a space he hadn't entered since they moved in. A dusty graveyard of forgotten furniture and sealed boxes. Clara's seasonal decorations were on one side. His past was on the other. He found the boxes labeled, Robert Avery Personal Effects. He tore them open. Old books, sweaters that still faintly smelled of pipe tobacco and cedar, university papers. But no satchel. Why wasn't the satchel there? If it went down on the boat, why wasn't it listed in the effects recovered? He dug deeper, pushing aside boxes, until he found a small, locked metal strongbox he didn't recognize. It had belonged to his mother, who had passed away 5 years after his father. Her death accelerated, Clara always said, by a broken heart. Thomas had the key on his father's old keyring, one he kept for sentimental reasons. He opened the box. Inside, it wasn't valuables. It was his mother's journals. He'd never read them. It felt like a violation. But now he was desperate. He sat on the dusty floor, the single bare bulb illuminating the pages, and began to read. He skipped through years of mundane entries, dinners, faculty parties, pride in Thomas's school achievements. Then he reached the months before the accident. The tone changed. The elegant script became frantic, spiky. Robert is in trouble. Deep trouble. He won't tell me what it is. He's terrified. A week later, he's meeting with awful men. Men in dark suits who don't smile. They came to the house when I was out. Robert was white as a sheet. He said we might have to go away. And then, the entry that stopped Thomas's heart, dated 2 days before the boating trip. Robert has a plan. Terrible, desperate plan. He says it's the only way to protect us. To protect Thomas. He's talking about the sea. He says he has to disappear. He made me promise to never tell. To let everyone believe it. How can I live with this? Thomas felt the attic spinning. It wasn't a grief hallucination. It wasn't a ghost. It was a lie. A 20-year-old lie that had defined his entire adult life. His father hadn't died in a storm. He had staged his own death. He had left them. The grief he'd carried was a sham. A construct built by the 2 people he trusted most. The image of the man at the station burned in his mind. It wasn't a stranger who looked like him. It was him. He had seen his father. His father, who was alive and well and catching commuter trains upstate. The betrayal was so profound, so acidic, it nearly made him sick. He flipped frantically through the rest of the journal, looking for more. Tucked into the back cover, taped against the cardboard, was a small, tarnished brass key. Below it, his mother had written a single line in her shaky hand. The Bank of New York, Box 428. His other life. The discovery of the key changed everything. The fog of doubt and the fear of his own insanity evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of betrayal. This was no longer a story of grief. It was an investigation. The next morning, Thomas didn't go to Grand Central. He went downtown to the imposing marble edifice of the Bank of New York. His hands were shaking as he presented the key and his mother's death certificate to the bank manager. He was led down to the vault, a place of hushed silence and cold steel. The attendant retrieved box 428, placed it on a table in a private viewing room, and left him alone. For a moment, Thomas just stared at the tarnished metal box. It was a Pandora's box, and he knew that once he opened it, the life he had known would be gone forever. He slid the key in. The lock turned with a stiff click. He lifted the lid. It wasn't full. There were only a few items inside, resting on velvet lining. The first thing he saw was a passport, a United States passport, but the name on it wasn't Robert Avery. It was Walter Anderson. The photo, however, was undeniably his father, taken perhaps 5 or 6 years after his death. He looked harder, more weathered, but it was him. Beside the passport was a birth certificate, a legitimate, state-issued certificate for a child named Luke Anderson, born 18 years ago. The mother's name was listed as Catherine Miller. The father, Walter Anderson. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. His father hadn't just run away. He had started over. He had a new name, a new woman, and a new son. A son who would now be a young man. A son who was only a few years younger than Thomas had been when his world ended. The rage was so sudden and intense it almost blinded him. All those years of mourning. All those years his mother withered away, consumed by a secret and a lie. All for this new life, this new family. He felt a desperate urge to sweep the box off the table, to scream. But there was one more item at the bottom. A single, dog-eared photograph, the kind taken with a cheap instant camera. It showed Walter, his father, standing with his arm around a smiling, unassuming woman with warm eyes and light brown hair cut in a simple bob. They were standing in front of a small, unremarkable blue house with white trim. In front of them, holding a toy truck, was a small boy who looked to be about 5 or 6. Luke. On the back of the photograph, written in his father's familiar, elegant handwriting, was an address. Not in Poughkeepsie, but in a small, sleepy town called Beacon, just a stop further up the Hudson line. He now had a name and a destination. The man at the station, it wasn't his father. His father would be in his early 70s now. The man at the station looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s. Wait. Thomas froze. He re-examined the photo. The woman, Catherine. He realized with a jolt who she looked like. A younger version of a woman he vaguely remembered from his childhood. Catherine Miller. She had been his father's teaching assistant at the university. A quiet, adoring graduate student. It was a sickening, terrible clarity. His father hadn't just run from dangerous men. He had run to her. But who was the man at the station? He looked like Thomas. He looked like Robert. Could it be? No. The dates didn't line up. Luke would only be 18. He needed answers he couldn't find in a box. There was only one person left who might hold the truth. One person from that old life who was still breathing. His Aunt Margaret, Robert's older sister. Margaret was 85, living in a quiet nursing home north of the city. He hadn't visited her in months. He drove there, the fake passport and the photograph feeling like lead weights in his jacket pocket. He found her sitting by a window, looking out at a small garden. She was frail, her mind often cloudy, but her eyes, the Avery blue, brightened when she saw him. Thomas, what a surprise, dear. He sat down, his heart heavy. He didn't know how to start. He just placed the photograph on her lap. She stared at it for a long time. Her hand, thin and spotted, began to tremble. Where did you get this? She whispered. He promised to destroy them all. Her words were a confession. He's alive, isn't he? Thomas's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, the movement jerky. Yes. And the story, the real story, finally came out, spilling from her in a torrent of guilt and grief. Robert had been in trouble. He was a gambler, something he'd hidden from Thomas and his mother. He owed a massive amount of money to very dangerous people. They had threatened Thomas. The fake death was the only way out. He had planned it with Catherine Miller, his graduate assistant, who was in love with him and pregnant with his child. His mother, heartbroken and trapped, had agreed to the lie to protect her son. Robert and Catherine vanished, starting a new life as the Andersons. Your mother, she never recovered, Margaret wept. The secret ate her alive. Robert sent money, through me. He tried to support you from afar. He always loved you, Thomas. He did it to save you. Save me. Thomas stood up, his voice rising. He destroyed me. He let me grieve for 20 years. He let his wife die of a broken heart. There's more, Margaret whispered, grabbing his hand. He couldn't stay away. Not forever. After your mother died, he started watching from a distance. He just wanted to see you, to see what kind of man you'd become. Thomas's blood ran cold. And the man at the station? That wasn't Robert, Margaret said, her voice cracking. Robert is very sick. He's been in and out of the hospital for years. That was his other son. Luke. He looks just like Robert did. Just like you do. Thomas finally understood. The man he saw wasn't a ghost of his father. He was his father's replacement. He was his half-brother. A living, breathing testament to the lie that had stolen his life. And Luke had been at Grand Central, perhaps running an errand, looking exactly like the father Thomas had lost. The drive to Beacon was fueled by a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and 20 years of suppressed rage. The revelation that the man at the station was a brother, a secret sibling who had grown up with the father Thomas thought was dead, was a betrayal deeper than the original lie. He drove through the darkening landscape, the Hudson River a sliver of mercury to his left. He wasn't sure what he was going to do. Was he going to scream? Was he going to demand answers? Or was he just going to look at the man who had authored his entire life's grief and then walk away? He didn't have a plan. He just had an address. He arrived in Beacon, a town that felt asleep, its streets quiet and lined with old Victorian homes. He found the address from the photograph. The small blue house with white trim. It looked exactly the same, perhaps just a bit more weathered. A light was on in the front window. Thomas parked across the street, his heart hammering so hard it hurt. He sat in the car for 10, 20, 30 minutes, the engine cooling, the silence of the street amplifying the storm inside him. This was it, the end of the lie. He finally got out, his legs feeling heavy, like he was walking through water. He crossed the street, walked up the short path, and stood on the porch. He could hear a television murmuring inside. He raised a trembling hand and knocked. The sound was deafening in the quiet. He heard footsteps, the sound of a lock turning. The door opened. Standing in the doorway was the man from the train station. Up close, the resemblance was horrifying. It was like looking at a version of himself from an alternate reality. He had Robert's eyes, Thomas's jawline, but his expression was open, curious, and utterly unfamiliar. He looked to be about 18 or 19, not 40. Thomas realized his mistake. Aunt Margaret said he looked like Robert did. This was Luke, the son. "Can I help you?" the young man asked, his voice polite. Thomas couldn't speak. He just stared, his mind trying to reconcile the image of this boy with the photograph of the 5-year-old. Are you Walter Anderson's son?" Thomas finally managed. Luke's expression clouded with confusion, then suspicion. "My father's name is Walter, yes. Who are you? Do I know you?" "Luke? Who is it?" A voice called from inside. It was weaker, thinner than Thomas remembered, but it was the voice that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades. The voice that had read him stories and taught him to sail. Luke turned. "Just some guy, Dad. He's asking for you." A figure emerged from the shadows of the hallway, shuffling forward, leaning heavily on a cane. He was thin, his silver-gray hair sparse, his face etched with lines of illness and age. But it was him. It was Robert Avery, or Walter Anderson. It was his father. Robert stopped dead when he saw Thomas. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a ghostly white. The cane clattered from his trembling hand. He knew instantly who Thomas was. "Thomas?" he breathed, the name a question and a confession. "My God, Thomas." "Hello, Dad," Thomas said, and the word tasted like poison. The entire universe seemed to constrict to that small porch. Luke looked back and forth between the two men, his face pale with dawning, terrified understanding. "Dad, what's going on? Why does he look like me?" The confrontation that followed was not the screaming match Thomas had envisioned. It was a pathetic, heartbreaking collapse. Robert, or Walter, crumbled, sobbing, trying to explain. He spoke of the debts, the threats against Thomas's life, the impossible choice. He spoke of Catherine, who had offered him a way out, a new life. He claimed he did it all to protect Thomas, to give him a chance to live free of the danger. "I watched you," he wept, clutching the doorframe. "I saw you graduate from a distance. I saw you meet Clara. I saw your life. You were safe. That's all I wanted. I never stopped loving you, son. I swear I never did." Thomas listened, his face a mask of stone. "You let Mom die," he said, his voice quiet, but shaking with a rage that was colder and sharper than any shout. "You let her die alone, carrying your lie. I couldn't come back." Robert cried. "Don't you understand? Coming back would have meant it was all for nothing. It would have put you in danger all over again. And him." Thomas spat, gesturing at Luke, who was standing frozen, tears streaming down his face. "What was he? The replacement?" "Don't," Luke whispered, finding his voice. "Dad, what is he talking about?" And so Thomas told him. He told this stranger, this brother, about the Ariadne, about the empty casket, about the 20 years of believing his father was dead. He watched the boy's world fall apart in real time, just as his own had. The final, terrible act of his father's betrayal was this, destroying not one, but 2 families with the same lie. Thomas looked at the old, sick man sobbing in the doorway. He felt no pity. He felt no connection. The man he had mourned was a hero, a flawed but brilliant professor lost to the sea. This man, this Walter, was a stranger, a coward who had run away and built a new life on the ashes of his old one. "The man at the station," Thomas said, his voice flat. "It was you, wasn't it, Luke? You were in the city." Luke nodded numbly. "My dad, he's sick. I was picking up his medication from a special pharmacy." Thomas nodded slowly. The ghost was solved. The mystery was gone. All that was left was the ugly, pathetic truth. He looked at Robert one last time. "You died on that boat," Thomas said. "You died 20 years ago. As far as I'm concerned, you're still dead." He turned around. "Thomas, wait, please," Robert begged. Thomas didn't stop. He walked back to his car, got in, and drove away, not looking back. He had found his father, only to realize he truly had lost him forever. The stories we tell, the secrets we keep, they don't just bury the past. They plant seeds that grow in the dark, and what sprouts is often a poisoned vine that chokes everyone it touches. The truth can set you free, but sometimes the truth is just a different kind of prison. If this story, this journey into the heart of a devastating family secret, found a way into your heart, please show your support for Forgotten Ties. It means the world to us. Go ahead and like this video. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single story, and most importantly, ring that notification bell. You never know what secrets are waiting to be uncovered.